The official explanation was always the same. The work was difficult. The fragments were small, damaged, required painstaking reconstruction. The editors were working as fast as they could, and there's truth in that. Some of the fragments are tiny. The script is ancient, and piecing together texts from hundreds of pieces is genuinely hard. But other scholars began to notice something odd. The editors weren't just slow, they were possessive. They wouldn't share photographs. They wouldn't allow other scholars to examine the fragments. Even colleagues who requested access for collaborative work were turned down. The scrolls had become, in effect, the private property of a small academic club. Let me give you a specific example of what this looked like on the ground. In the 1980s, a scholar named Norman Golb at the University of Chicago began questioning the consensus view that the scrolls came from a single Essene community at Qumran. Golb argued the scrolls were too diverse, reflecting multiple viewpoints, and likely came from Jerusalem libraries hidden during the Roman siege. Whether Golb was right or wrong isn't the point here. What matters is that his theory required examining the unpublished fragments to test it. He was denied access. The official editors controlled the material, and if you weren't part of the team, you couldn't see it. This wasn't a matter of protecting fragile artifacts. Photographs existed. Digital images could have been shared. The restriction was about control over interpretation. The tension built slowly, year after year, until it exploded in the late 1980s. Herschel Shanks, editor of Biblical Archaeology Review, started running articles with titles like The Scandal of the Dead Sea Scrolls. He interviewed frustrated scholars, documented the delays, and accused the editorial team of operating a monopoly. The team responded defensively. They argued that outsiders didn't understand the complexity of the work. They said opening access prematurely would lead to irresponsible scholarship and sensational misinterpretations. But Shanks kept pushing, and he wasn't alone. Scholars at major universities, rabbis, and even some Christian theologians began demanding openness. The pressure was building, but the editors held firm. Then, in 1991, two things happened that broke the monopoly. First, the Huntington Library in California announced it had a complete set of photographs of the scrolls and was making them available to any scholar who wanted to see them. The library's director, William Moffett, essentially said, "These belong to humanity, not to a private club." The official editorial team was furious, but there was nothing they could do. The photographs were out. Second, Ben Zion Wacholder and Martin Abegg at Hebrew Union College used that leaked concordance, the one Shanks had published, to reverse engineer the text of unpublished fragments. They used a computer to reconstruct the scrolls from the index, then published their reconstruction. It was a brilliant end run around the access restrictions, and it worked. Within months, the Israel Antiquities Authority, which had taken control of the scrolls after the 1967 war, announced that all restrictions were lifted. Any qualified scholar could now access the scrolls. So that's the basic story, a monopoly that lasted nearly 40 years, broken by leaks and public pressure. But here's the question we need to sit with. Why did the monopoly exist in the first place? And this is where things get genuinely murky, because the motivations aren't documented in the same way the access restrictions are. We have theories, allegations, and patterns, but we don't have smoking gun memos that say, we're hiding these because they contradict church doctrine. What we have is circumstantial evidence and a lot of reasonable suspicion. Let's start with the most sensational allegation, which you've probably heard some version of. The Vatican was suppressing the scrolls because they threatened Christian theology. This theory gained traction in the 1990s, especially after books like The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception by Michael Begant and Richard Lee. Their argument went something like this. The scrolls show that early Christianity borrowed heavily from the Qumran community, that Jesus might have been influenced by or even part of this sect, and that this undermines the uniqueness of Christian claims. Therefore, The church wanted to control the narrative by controlling access. Begant and Lee pointed to the fact that several of the editors were priests or had Vatican ties, and they suggested this wasn't coincidental. Now, here's where we have to be careful. The fact that some editors were Catholic priests doesn't prove a conspiracy. Archaeology in the Middle East in the mid-20th century was often conducted by religious institutions. They had the funding, the language skills, and the scholarly infrastructure. The Pontifical Biblical Institute and the École Biblique in Jerusalem were serious academic institutions, not propaganda mills. But the perception of a conflict of interest is legitimate. If you're a Catholic priest editing texts that might challenge the historical foundations of Christianity, can you be fully objective? Mainstream scholars, including many Catholic scholars, will tell you yes, that academic training overcomes personal bias. But the concern isn't irrational. What does the actual content of the scrolls tell us? Do they threaten Christianity? The honest answer is, it depends on your theology. The scrolls do show that some Jewish sects before and during the time of Jesus practiced ritual baptism, had communal meals, expected a Messiah, and used dualistic language about light and darkness, themes that also appear in the New Testament, especially in the Gospel of John. This doesn't mean Jesus wasn't a saint, but it does mean that some ideas once thought to be unique to Christianity were circulating in Jewish thought at the time. For some Christians, that's perfectly fine. It situates Jesus within Jewish tradition. For others, especially those invested in a model where Christianity represents a radical break from Judaism, it's more uncomfortable. But uncomfortable isn't the same as suppressed. Tomakiluik, most biblical scholars, including conservative Christian ones, have integrated the scrolls into their work without abandoning their faith. So did the Vatican suppress the scrolls? The documented evidence doesn't support a direct Vatican conspiracy. What the evidence does support is a more mundane, but still troubling pattern. A small group of scholars, some with religious affiliations, controlled access to important texts and used that control to maintain their academic authority. They weren't necessarily hiding heresy. They were protecting their careers, their reputations, and their monopoly on interpretation. Roland de Vaux died in 1971, and his successors inherited the same system. They had already spent years or decades working on their assigned fragments. Opening access meant competition, the possibility of being corrected or contradicted, and the loss of their special status. That's a very human motivation, and it doesn't require a grand conspiracy. But let's push deeper, because there's another layer here. The Dead Sea Scrolls aren't just religious texts, they're also political. The question of who controls ancient Jewish and Christian manuscripts is tied to questions of legitimacy, heritage, and authority in the modern Middle East. When the scrolls were first discovered, the area was under Jordanian control. After the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel took control of East Jerusalem and, with it, the scrolls. The Israel Antiquities Authority became the custodian. Some scholars have argued that Israel also had reasons to control the narrative, specifically to emphasize the Jewish connection to the land, and to downplay any evidence that might complicate the straightforward ancient Israel to modern Israel continuity narrative. But again, we're in the realm of possible motives, not documented proof. What we can say for certain is that by the 1980s, the access restrictions had created a perception problem. The scrolls were seen as being held hostage by Christians, by Israel, by elites, depending on who was doing the accusing. And perception matters. When scholars and the public lose trust in the custodians of historical artifacts, it undermines the entire enterprise of historical research. This is why the eventual opening of access in 1991 was so important. It wasn't just about the scrolls. It was about restoring credibility to the process. Let's talk about what happened after access opened. Did the sky fall? Did radical new interpretations overturn everything we thought we knew? Not really. What happened was more subtle and in some ways more interesting. With hundreds of scholars now able to study the scrolls, the pace of publication accelerated dramatically. By the early 2000s, the majority of the Dead Sea Scrolls had been published in critical editions. New theories emerged, old theories were tested, and the scholarly debate became richer and more complex. Some of the original editors' interpretations were confirmed. Others were revised or rejected. That's how scholarship is supposed to work, through open debate and peer review, not through gatekeeping. One of the most significant developments was the use of new technology. Infrared imaging, multispectral analysis, and digital reconstruction allowed scholars to read texts that were previously illegible. In some cases, fragments that had been misidentified or poorly translated by the original editors were corrected. This wasn't malicious on the part of the original editors. Ancient languages are hard, and mistakes happen. But it does show the value of having multiple eyes on the material. The monopoly wasn't just slow. It was also limiting the quality of the scholarship. There's a specific scroll that illustrates this perfectly, 4QMMT, also known as Some Observances of the Law. This text is a letter from the Qumran community to the Jerusalem priesthood, outlining legal disagreements. It's one of the most important scrolls for understanding the relationship between the Qumran sect and mainstream Judaism. The scroll was assigned to one of the original editors, John Strugnell, who worked on it for years, but didn't publish. In 1990, Strugnell gave an interview where he made inflammatory remarks about Judaism, calling it a horrible religion. He was subsequently removed from his position as chief editor. The incident was a disaster for the scroll team's credibility and underscored the problem with concentrating power in so few hands. If Strugnell had been one voice among many, his views, however offensive, would have been less consequential. But because he controlled access to key texts, his biases had the potential to shape the entire field. After Strugnell's removal, 4QMMT was finally published, and scholars were able to study it. The text didn't overturn Judaism or Christianity. What it did was provide crucial evidence about Jewish legal debates in the Second Temple period. It showed that the Qumran community was engaged in serious halakhic legal reasoning and saw itself as preserving the true interpretation of Torah. This is valuable for historians of Judaism, but it's not dangerous. The only thing at risk was the ego of scholars who might have had different theories. Now, I want to address a question you might be asking. If the scrolls don't contain shocking revelations, why does this story matter? Why should anyone care about academic infighting over ancient fragments? Here's why. The Dead Sea Scrolls case is a lens through which we can see how knowledge is controlled, who gets to decide what's important, and what happens when gatekeepers prioritize their own interests over public access. This pattern repeats throughout history. Whether it's the Catholic Church controlling access to Galileo's manuscripts, colonial museums hoarding artifacts from colonized nations, or pharmaceutical companies restricting access to clinical trial data, the mechanism is the same. Those who control information control the narrative. The Dead Sea Scrolls story is also a reminder that transparency and openness produce better scholarship. The decades of restricted access didn't protect the scrolls from misinterpretation, they invited it. Conspiracy theories flourished precisely because the process was secretive. When the scrolls finally became accessible, the conspiracy theories lost much of their power because scholars could actually examine the evidence themselves. Sunlight, as they say, is the best disinfectant. Let me take you to one more moment in this story because it captures something essential about the human element in all of this. In 1993, 2 years after access opened, there was a conference in New York where many of the key players gathered: original editors, new scholars, librarians, journalists. Herschel Shanks was there, and so was one of the original editors, Eugene Ulrich. By all accounts, the atmosphere was tense, but also, in a strange way, celebratory. The fight was over. The scrolls were open. Ulrich, in his remarks, acknowledged that the delays had been too long and that the team should have been more transparent. It wasn't a full apology, but it was an admission. Shanks, for his part, didn't gloat. He emphasized that the goal had never been to destroy reputations, but to serve scholarship and the public interest. Whether you believe everyone's motives were pure is up to you, but the moment represented a kind of détente. The monopoly was broken, and everyone could move forward. There's one last thread I want to pull, and it has to do with what the scrolls tell us about the nature of religious texts themselves. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, the oldest complete Hebrew Bible manuscripts dated to around the 9th or 10th century CE. Scholars knew that the biblical text had been transmitted with great care, but they didn't have direct evidence of what it looked like 2,000 years ago. The scrolls provided that evidence, and what they showed was both reassuring and unsettling. On one hand, the biblical texts found at Qumran are remarkably similar to the Masoretic text, the standard Hebrew Bible used today. This suggests that the transmission process was indeed careful and accurate. On the other hand, the scrolls also show variation. Different copies of the same book sometimes have different wordings, different verse orders, even different theological emphasis. This isn't scandalous, but it does complicate the idea of a single, unchanging original text handed down from God. For some religious believers, this is a challenge. If the text varied, which version is authoritative? For others, it's a deepening. It shows that the biblical text emerged from a living tradition of reading, copying, debating, and interpreting. The scrolls don't undermine faith, but they do undermine a certain kind of literalism. And maybe that's what some of the editors were uncomfortable with. Not the content of the scrolls, but the implications of textual fluidity. If you've built a career on the idea that the Bible is fixed and inerrant, evidence of ancient variation is professionally inconvenient. But here's the thing. Most of the original editors weren't fundamentalists. They were trained philologists and historians. They knew about textual criticism. So if they were uncomfortable with the scrolls, it wasn't because of naivete. It might have been because they understood the implications all too well and weren't ready for the public to grapple with them. Or maybe they just wanted to control the pace and framing of the discussion. We can't read their minds, and the documents they left behind don't give us a clear answer. What we have is a pattern of behavior: restriction, defensiveness, slow publication. And we have to interpret that pattern. Let's also talk about money, because that's part of this story too. The scrolls are valuable, not just intellectually, but financially. Fragments have been sold on the black market. In 2002, a Norwegian collector paid millions for what were later revealed to be forgeries. The Qumran scrolls themselves are priceless, but the photographs, publications, and rights to reproduce the texts generate revenue. Academic publishers made money from the official editions. The Israel Antiquities Authority charges fees for high-resolution images. This doesn't mean the delays were purely mercenary, but financial incentives were part of the ecosystem. If you're one of the few scholars with access, you have a marketable asset. You can publish books, give lectures, consult for museums. Opening access dilutes that asset. Again, this is a human motivation, not a conspiracy, but it's worth acknowledging. There's also the question of nationalism and heritage. The scrolls were discovered in what was then British Mandate Palestine, later Jordan, now Israel. The Bedouin who found them sold fragments to antiquities dealers. Some ended up in the hands of the Syrian Orthodox Church. Others were purchased by Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin. The scrolls are, in a literal sense, artifacts of contested land. Who has the right to control them? Israel argues that as the inheritor of the Jewish tradition and the current custodian of the sites, It has both the legal and the moral claim. Palestinians and others argue that the scrolls are part of the broader cultural heritage of the region and shouldn't be nationalized. This is a genuinely difficult question, and it's one reason why international access was so important. By making the scrolls available to scholars worldwide, the Israel Antiquities Authority effectively said, "These belong to global scholarship, not to any one nation or religion." But even that openness has limits. The physical scrolls are still in Israel. Scholars can study photographs and digital images, but to see the actual artifacts, you have to go to Jerusalem. That's not always easy, especially for scholars from countries that don't have diplomatic relations with Israel. So access is better than it was, but it's not universal. This is a reminder that control over artifacts is also control over who gets to study them and under what conditions. Now, let me circle back to the question I posed at the beginning. Was the delay in publishing the scrolls legitimate scholarship, or was something else happening? Based on the documented evidence, I think the answer is both. The work was genuinely difficult. Ancient manuscripts are hard. The fragments were numerous and fragmentary, but the delays were also a function of institutional inertia, personal ego, and a reluctance to share power. The editors weren't villains, but they also weren't heroes. They were scholars operating in a system that rewarded exclusivity and didn't have strong mechanisms for accountability. The fact that it took public pressure, leaks, and institutional intervention to open access suggests that the system was broken. What the Dead Sea Scrolls story teaches us is that good intentions aren't enough. Even well-meaning scholars can create bottlenecks if they're not held accountable. The solution isn't to abolish expertise or to throw open every archive to anyone with an internet connection. Some restrictions are necessary to protect fragile materials, to ensure quality control, to prevent looting and forgery, but those restrictions need to be transparent, time-limited, and subject to oversight. The Dead Sea Scrolls monopoly lasted as long as it did because there was no mechanism to force publication or to reassign fragments to other scholars. Once that changed, the problem resolved itself. There is a broader lesson here about how we handle knowledge that sits at the intersection of religion, history, and politics. The Dead Sea Scrolls matter because they touch on questions that people care deeply about: the origins of the Bible, the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, the nature of religious authority. When scholars control access to evidence related to those questions, they hold enormous power. That power can be used responsibly, but it can also be abused. The only safeguard is openness, not just in the final publication, but in the process. Let people see the evidence. Let them ask questions. Let the debate happen in public, not behind closed doors. And here's something that often gets lost in these discussions: the people of Qumran themselves. We spend so much time talking about who controls the scrolls that we forget. The scrolls are a window into an actual community of people who lived, worked, prayed, and wrote 2,000 years ago. They weren't writing for us. They were writing for themselves and their descendants. They copied biblical texts because they revered them. They wrote sectarian documents because they believed they were living in the end times and needed to preserve the true interpretation of the law. The scrolls are their legacy, and in a way, all of our arguments about access and interpretation are secondary to that. We're guests in their textual world, trying to understand what they thought and why it mattered to them. When I think about the Qumran community, I imagine the scribe sitting in a small room, lamplight flickering, carefully copying Isaiah or composing a commentary on Habakkuk. I imagine the debates in the communal hall about whether to eat with the priests in Jerusalem or to separate entirely. I imagine the moment when they heard the Roman legions were coming and decided to hide their scrolls in jars in the caves, hoping someone would find them and understand. They succeeded. We found the scrolls. But for decades, we didn't do right by them. We treated their words as academic property instead of as a trust. The opening of access in 1991 was the beginning of doing right by them. Since then, hundreds of scholars have worked on the scrolls from dozens of countries and representing multiple religious traditions. Jewish scholars, Christian scholars, secular scholars, all contributing to the conversation. That's the kind of scholarship the scrolls deserve, not a monopoly, but a chorus. So where does this leave us? The Dead Sea Scrolls are now among the most studied ancient texts in the world. They've been digitized, published, translated into multiple languages. You can read them online if you want. The mysteries they contain are genuine. There are still fragments that are hard to interpret, debates about which group wrote which texts, questions about how they ended up in the caves. But those are scholarly mysteries, not bureaucratic ones. The documents are available. The work continues. The monopoly is over. But the patterns that created the monopoly are still with us. Right now, there are other archives, other artifacts, other collections that are similarly restricted, some for good reasons, some for bad. The lesson of the Dead Sea Scrolls is that we need to ask hard questions about who controls knowledge and why. And we need to demand transparency and accountability from the institutions we trust with our shared heritage. Because that's what the scrolls are, not Christian or Jewish, not Israeli or Palestinian, but human. A record of what people believed, how they lived, what they hoped for, and that belongs to all of us. If you've made it this far, I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts. Do you think the delays were justified by the complexity of the work, or do you see it as gatekeeping? And more broadly, how do we balance the need for expert scholarship with the public's right to access? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to go deeper into this, I've covered the actual content of some of the key scrolls in another video. I'll link it. This is one of those stories where the more you look, the more layers you find. Thanks for sticking with it. And here's the thing I can't stop thinking about. Somewhere in those caves 2,000 years ago, someone carefully wrapped a scroll in linen, placed it in a jar, and sealed it, not knowing whether anyone would ever read it again. They did it anyway. They trusted the future. And when we finally found their words, what did we do? We locked them away for 40 years. We're the ones they trusted, and for a long time, we failed them. But eventually, because of people who refused to accept secrecy, who pushed and leaked and demanded better, we got it right. The scrolls are open now. The question is, what other trusts are we failing right now? Because it's easier to keep things closed than to let the light in.